Look at the history books. Pause. They talk about power. They talk about victory. But they rarely talk about fear. This is the story of Joseph Stalin. Not the leader people admired, but the man who turned his own country into a battlefield. A war without enemies at the borders. A war inside his own people. And millions paid the price in silence. In the Soviet Union, trust became dangerous. Neighbors watched neighbors. Friends watched friends. One wrong word. One wrong look. And your life could end overnight. Stalin did not only rule with laws. He ruled with fear. And fear became stronger than loyalty. At night, doors were knocked. Not gently. Not politely. Soldiers took people away. Fathers. Mothers. Teachers. Writers. Most never returned. Their crime was simple. Being suspected. In Stalin's world, suspicion was enough to destroy a life. The prisons were full. But the camps were fuller. Cold lands. Endless snow. No mercy. These were the gulags. Where millions were sent to work. Not to survive. But to slowly disappear. Stalin called it discipline. History calls it suffering without limits. People stopped speaking freely. They stopped thinking freely. Because every thought felt dangerous. Every opinion felt like a risk. Fear lived in homes. Fear lived in schools. Fear lived in the streets. The Soviet Union became quiet. Not because people agreed. But because they were afraid to breathe too loudly. Children learned early. Do not ask questions. Do not trust anyone. Not even family. Because one sentence could change everything. Stalin's power was not just political. It was psychological. He controlled minds before he controlled bodies. And once fear ruled the mind, the war was already won. Some people tried to resist. Most disappeared. Some tried to escape. Most failed. Borders were closed. Voices were silenced. Truth was buried. Stalin did not only fight enemies. He created them. Because fear needs a target. And he chose his own people. History often shows Stalin as a strong leader. But strength built on terror is not strength. It is cruelty. Behind every factory success, behind every military victory, there were families destroyed, lives erased, dreams forgotten. The Soviet Union moved forward, while millions were left behind in darkness. No one felt safe. Not soldiers. Not politicians. Not even Stalin's closest friends. Power did not protect you. Loyalty did not save you. Because fear has no rules. One day you were trusted. The next day, you were gone. In Stalin's war, there were no winners. Only survivors. Today, we speak freely about the past. But back then, silence was survival. People learned to hide their thoughts. Hide their pain. Hide their tears. Stalin's greatest weapon was not the army. It was fear itself. A fear so deep that even decades later, its shadow still follows history. The fear did not stop at the streets. It entered the homes. It sat at dinner tables. It listened to every conversation. Families learned to whisper. Children learned to stay quiet. Because even walls felt like they had ears. In Stalin's Russia, silence was not weakness. Silence was protection. And speaking the truth was the fastest way to disappear. Letters were opened. Phones were listened to. Nothing was private. People lived under constant watch. Not by strangers, but by their own neighbors. Trust became a dangerous mistake. Because anyone could report anyone. And one report was enough. To erase a name. To destroy a family. To turn a normal life into a nightmare. The knock on the door came at night. Always at night. When fear was strongest. When hope was weakest. People woke up to soldiers. To questions. To accusations. Most never saw daylight again. They left their homes behind. Their children behind. Their lives behind. And history wrote their endings in silence. The trains never stopped. They carried human cargo. Men. Women. Even teenagers. Packed into dark wagons. No food. No warmth. No future promised. Only the long road to the camps. For Stalin, these were enemies. For reality. They were victims of a system that fed on fear. In the gulags. Time lost its meaning. Days felt endless. Nights felt colder. People worked until their bodies failed. Not to build a future. But to survive one more day. Some died from hunger. Some from exhaustion. Some from despair. And the world outside kept moving. As if none of this was happening. Stalin spoke of loyalty. Of unity. Of strength. But his methods created only suspicion. Only betrayal. Only loneliness. People learned to smile in public. And fear in private. Because showing doubt was dangerous. And showing honesty was deadly. In his war on his people. Truth became the first casualty. Even heroes were not safe. War veterans. Party leaders. Famous thinkers. All could fall overnight. Because Stalin trusted no one. Power made him paranoid. And paranoia became policy. If someone stood too tall, they were cut down. Not for crimes. But for being noticed too much. The newspapers told one story. Victory. Progress. Success. But the streets told another. Fear. Loss. Empty homes. Children without parents. Parents without answers. The truth lived in whispers. Hidden between lines. Because in Stalin's world, reality was dangerous to admit. People stopped dreaming. They stopped planning. Because tomorrow was never certain. Life became about one thing only. Survival. Not happiness. Not freedom. Just staying alive. Every day was a test. Every night a risk. In this silent war, living quietly was the bravest act of all. Years passed. But the fear stayed. Even when the arrests slowed. The memories did not. People carried trauma in their hearts. In their eyes. In their silence. Stalin's rule ended one day. But its shadow did not. Because some wounds do not heal. They only fade. And wait to be remembered again. In Stalin's world, truth became a dangerous word. People learned to change their stories. To erase their past. To pretend they were someone else. Because who you were yesterday could destroy you tomorrow. Names disappeared from records. Faces vanished from photos. History itself was rewritten. And fear decided what was allowed to exist. The prisons were full of silence. Not peace. Silence of broken spirits. Men who once spoke freely. Now barely spoke at all. Because every word felt risky. Every sentence felt like a trap. Stalin didn't need chains everywhere. He built a prison inside the mind. And once fear locked that door, escape became impossible. Families waited for news. Days turned into months. Months into years. Some never received answers. Only rumors. Only empty hope. Children grew up without fathers. Wives grew old without husbands. And the state moved on. As if these lives never mattered. In Stalin's war, forgetting was part of the punishment. Every arrest sent a message. Not just to the victim, but to everyone watching. This could be you. Tomorrow. Next week. Any time. Fear spread faster than any army. Because it didn't need borders. It lived in hearts. And once fear ruled the heart, resistance became a dream too dangerous to keep. Some people tried to stay invisible. They avoided attention. They avoided success. Because success could be suspicious. Being noticed was risky. Being praised was dangerous. In Stalin's system, standing out meant standing alone. And standing alone meant falling faster. So people learned to hide their talents. Just to stay alive. The government spoke of unity. But unity built on fear is not unity. It is obedience. People followed orders. Not because they believed, but because they were terrified. Stalin ruled a nation that looked strong. But inside, it was trembling. A country marching forward. While millions walked in silent terror. Some tried to write the truth. Poets. Journalists. Thinkers. Most were silenced. Because words were powerful. And Stalin feared words more than weapons. A sentence could inspire hope. And hope was dangerous. So books disappeared. Voices disappeared. And only one story remained. The one allowed by fear. Even laughter felt risky. A joke could be misunderstood. A smile could be questioned. People learned to control their faces. Their voices. Their emotions. Because freedom was not only lost in actions. It was lost in expressions. Stalin didn't just rule behavior. He ruled feelings. And when a leader controls fear, he controls everything. The war against his own people was invisible. No front lines. No uniforms. Just quiet destruction. Lives erased without battles. Families broken without explosions. History often remembers wars with noise. But this war happened in silence. And silence made it harder to stop. Because the world heard nothing. While millions suffered everything. When Stalin finally died, people cried in public. But in private, many felt relief. Not joy. Not celebration. Just the end of constant fear. Yet even after his death, people still whispered. Still looked over their shoulders. Because fear had lived too long. And when fear stays that long, it never leaves completely. After years of fear, people forgot how to feel safe. Even simple moments felt dangerous. A knock on the door. A sudden sound. A stranger's look. Everything created tension. Because trauma does not disappear with time. It hides inside memories. Inside silence. Stalin's war ended on paper. But in the minds of the people, it continued for generations. Children grew up learning fear before hope. They learned what not to say. Before they learned how to dream. Their parents taught them survival lessons. Not life lessons. Do not trust easily. Do not speak loudly. Do not stand out. This is how a nation raised a generation. Not to be free. But to stay invisible. Because in Stalin's world, visibility was danger. Some survivors tried to forget. Others could not. Nightmares followed them. Even in safety. Even in peace. They remembered the cold. The hunger. The endless waiting. Freedom felt strange after years of control. Because when fear rules for too long, peace feels unreal. And silence no longer feels calm. It feels threatening. The government spoke of rebuilding. Of healing. Of moving forward. But wounds like these do not close easily. Families searched for answers. For graves. For names. But many stories were lost forever. Stalin's system destroyed records. Just like it destroyed lives. And when history loses its witnesses, truth becomes harder to protect. Some people finally spoke years later. About the camps. About the arrests. About the fear. Their voices trembled. Not from weakness. But from memory. Because even decades later, talking about the past still felt dangerous. Stalin's power ended in history books. But in their hearts, it never truly disappeared. The world slowly learned the truth. Not from leaders. But from survivors. From broken voices. From painful memories. Stories of hunger. Of cold nights. Of endless labor. These were not accidents. They were decisions. Decisions made by a man who chose control. Over compassion. Power, over humanity. Some asked a simple question. How could this happen? How could millions suffer in silence? The answer is fear. Fear closes mouths. Fear closes eyes. Fear closes hearts. And when fear becomes normal, cruelty becomes invisible. Stalin did not only destroy lives. He changed how people accepted pain. And that was his greatest crime. Even today, the echoes remain. In stories told quietly. In memories shared carefully. People still lower their voices when they speak of that time. Because fear shaped a culture of silence. A silence that protected lives. But stole freedom. Stalin's war taught a cruel lesson. When survival becomes the goal, freedom becomes a luxury. The Soviet Union moved forward. But the past followed behind. Like a shadow. Like a warning. Because nations remember their trauma. Even when they pretend not to. Stalin's legacy is not only in statues. Or history books. It lives in the fear of speaking freely. A fear that once ruled millions. And still whispers today. History often focuses on leaders. On victories. On power. But real history lives with the people. With those who suffered. With those who survived. Stalin's war was not fought on borders. It was fought in homes. In hearts. In silence. And the true cost of that war is not measured in battles, but in broken lives. Years later, people still asked why. Why no one stopped it? Why no one spoke louder? But fear does not allow courage to grow. When every word can be your last. Silence feels safer than truth. Stalin understood this well. He did not only punish rebellion. He prevented it from being born. And when fear shapes behavior, even injustice becomes routine. Some survivors carried guilt. Not for crimes. But for living. They asked themselves. Why me? Why not them? This is what terror leaves behind. Not only pain. But questions with no answers. Stalin's war did not end with arrests. It continued in memories. In dreams. In the quiet moments when the past returned without warning. The camps were far away. But their impact reached every city, every village, every family. Because fear travels faster than news. People changed how they lived, how they spoke, how they trusted. A nation learned to survive by hiding, not by hoping. Stalin built factories and armies. But he also built a culture of silence. And that silence lasted longer than his rule. Some tried to defend him. They spoke of progress, of strength, of victories. But progress built on fear is not progress. It is control. True strength does not need terror. But Stalin chose terror anyway. Because fear is faster than respect. And obedience is easier than loyalty. In his world, power meant never having to explain. Families learned to live with absence. Empty chairs at the table. Unanswered questions. Photographs hidden in drawers. Because even memories felt dangerous. People erased parts of their own lives. Just to stay safe. Stalin did not only remove people from society. He removed them from history. And when names disappear, pain becomes invisible. But invisible pain never truly leaves. Years later, archives opened. Secrets came out. Numbers appeared. Millions affected. Millions lost. But no number can measure fear. No statistic can explain silence. Because terror is not just physical. It lives in habits. In hesitation. In the way people look around before speaking. Stalin's war changed behavior. And behavior outlives any ruler. Some people finally forgave. Others never could. Both carried scars. Because forgiveness does not erase memory. And memory does not erase pain. The past stayed close. Even in new times. Even with new leaders. Because trauma does not follow politics. It follows people. Stalin ruled for decades. But his impact ruled longer. In the hearts of those who survived. History often asks us to move on. To look forward. To forget. But forgetting is dangerous. Because what is forgotten can be repeated. The story of Stalin is not only about one man. It is about what happens when fear replaces justice. When power replaces humanity. And when silence replaces truth. This is why remembering matters. Even when it hurts. Every generation inherits a lesson. Some learn it from books. Others from pain. The Soviet people learned it the hardest way. They learned what unchecked power looks like. What blind loyalty costs. And how fast freedom can disappear. Stalin's war showed the world something brutal. The greatest threat to a nation can come from inside. Not from enemies abroad. But from fear at home. Today, we speak these words freely. But once, they could cost a life. That is the difference time makes. And the reason memory matters. Stalin's war on his own people is not just a chapter in history. It is a warning. A reminder. That power without limits turns leaders into tyrants. And nations into prisons. If we forget that, we risk learning it again. Some people tried to rebuild their lives. New jobs. New cities. New names. But the past followed quietly. In habits. In fears. In the way they never felt safe. Because once trust is broken, it takes generations to heal. Stalin's war did not end with freedom. It left a nation learning again. How to live without fear. Even simple choices felt heavy. Where to live. What to say. Who to trust. People measured every step. Because mistakes once meant death. And that memory stayed alive. Freedom arrived slowly. Carefully. Like a fragile gift. Stalin ruled with terror for years. But removing terror took even longer. Some families finally found names. On lists. In archives. On forgotten pages. A father. A mother. A brother. Gone for decades. Now remembered. But answers did not bring peace. Only closure mixed with pain. Because knowing the truth does not change what was lost. People began to tell their stories. Quietly at first. Then louder. About arrests. About camps. About fear. Each story added a piece of truth. Not the official truth. But the human one. Stalin's image slowly changed. From hero to warning. And history finally listened to the voices it once ignored. Some asked how one man gained so much power. The answer is simple. And frightening. People were afraid to stop him. Institutions were afraid to question him. And fear became stronger than law. Stalin did not rise alone. He rose on silence. On obedience. On terror. And when fear supports power, power grows without limits. Years passed. But fear learned how to hide. Not in screams. Not in arrests. But in habits. People still lowered their voices. Still looked around before speaking. Because fear had become normal. Stalin's war changed more than laws. It changed behavior. And behavior is harder to defeat than any army. Even when danger is gone. The memory of danger stays. Some survivors tried to teach hope. To their children. To their grandchildren. They spoke about courage. About dignity. About truth. But every lesson carried pain. Because the past was never far away. Stalin's rule ended in history. But it lived on in warnings. In quiet advice. In words like, be careful. Be silent. Be safe. The archives revealed more stories. Not just of leaders. But of ordinary people. A teacher arrested for a joke. A worker punished for a rumor. A student lost for a question. These were not enemies. They were citizens. But fear does not see people. It sees threats. And Stalin built a system that turned everyone into a possible enemy. Some asked how a nation could survive this. The answer is resilience. People found strength in small things. In family. In memories. In hope they never showed. They carried pain quietly. So their children could live louder. Stalin tried to control the future. By destroying the present. But the human spirit refused to disappear. Even under terror. It waited for its moment. When the truth finally spread. It shocked the world. But for the people who lived it. It was not news. It was memory. They did not need numbers. They did not need reports. They had faces. Names. Voices. Stalin's war was written in documents. But it was lived in hearts. And hearts never forget what fear feels like. Some leaders tried to apologize. Others tried to forget. But forgetting does not heal. It only delays pain. True healing begins with truth. And truth begins with courage. Stalin ruled through silence. But silence cannot rule forever. Because stories find their way out. Through generations. Through time. And when they do, they change how history is remembered. Young people today ask, could this happen again? The answer is uncomfortable. Yes. If fear replaces law. If loyalty replaces justice. If silence replaces truth. Stalin's war teaches us this. Not as a warning from the past, but as a message for every future. Power without limits always finds a way to repeat itself. Every survivor carried two lives. The one they lived before fear. And the one they lived after. They learned to survive twice. Once in terror. Once in freedom. But freedom felt fragile. Because they knew how quickly it could vanish. Stalin did not only steal years. He stole innocence. Trust. Peace of mind. Things that time struggles to return. Some people became historians. Not in books. But in memory. They told their children stories. Not to frighten them. But to protect them. Because knowing the past is the strongest defense against repeating it. Stalin's war ended decades ago. But its lesson lives today. In every conversation about power. In every choice between fear and freedom. The story of Stalin is not just political. It is human. It is about families torn apart. Lives interrupted. Dreams erased. And courage found in silence. History may record dates. But people remember feelings. Fear. Loss. Hope. And when we tell this story today, we do it for one reason. So that fear never rules again. The world watched from afar. Some believed the propaganda. Some chose not to see. Because truth was uncomfortable. And distance made it easier to ignore. But suffering does not need an audience. It happens anyway. Stalin's war proved one thing. Evil does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it arrives quietly. And stays for years before anyone dares to speak. Years later, new leaders came. New promises. New words. But old fear remained. Because fear does not leave with elections. It leaves with time. With trust. With safety. And those take generations to build. Stalin's greatest damage was not only what he did, but what he taught people to expect from those in power. Some people turned pain into purpose. They became writers, teachers, witnesses. They told the stories no one wanted to hear. Because silence had lasted too long. And truth deserved a voice. Each story was an act of courage. Not against soldiers. But against forgetting. Stalin ruled with fear. But memory became the strongest resistance. The younger generations asked questions. What really happened? Why were people afraid? And slowly, the answers came. Not from leaders. But from grandparents. From survivors. From broken voices that finally spoke. History changed shape. Not as a tale of power. But as a lesson of loss. And the price of silence. Stalin's war on his own people is not just about the past. It is about every future. Because every nation faces a choice. Fear, or freedom. Silence, or truth. Control, or compassion. The story we tell today shapes the world tomorrow. And if we remember this lesson, we honor those who suffered. Not with tears alone. But with the courage to never repeat it. Time moves forward. But memory walks with us. Not loudly. Not proudly. But quietly. In stories told at night. In warnings passed down. In lessons written with pain. Stalin's war ended long ago. But its meaning remains today. Because every generation must decide. Will fear rule again? Or will courage finally speak louder? Some nations learn from history. Others repeat it. The difference is memory. When people forget suffering, they forget the price of freedom. Stalin showed the world how fast liberty can vanish. Not in years. Not in decades. But overnight. All it takes is silence. All it takes is fear. And suddenly, a nation becomes its own prison. We often ask, how did people survive? The answer is simple. They held on to hope. Even when they could not show it. They protected their families. They protected their memories. They protected the truth inside themselves. Because when everything is taken, hope becomes the last form of resistance. Stalin tried to control lives. But he could not fully control the human spirit. Every story told today is an act of courage. Because silence once ruled everything. Now, voices break that silence. Not to reopen wounds, but to prevent new ones. The past cannot be changed. But the future can. And remembering Stalin's war is not about blame. It is about responsibility. The responsibility to protect freedom. Before fear returns again. Some leaders build with fear. Others build with trust. History shows the difference clearly. Fear creates obedience. But trust creates loyalty. Stalin chose obedience. And millions suffered. The lesson is simple. Power without humanity destroys everything. Nations. Families. Lives. And when power forgets compassion, history never forgets the damage. Today, we have choices. We can speak. We can question. We can remember. These freedoms were once dangerous. People died for less than a word. Stalin's war reminds us. Silence is never neutral. It always helps the strongest voice. And when that voice spreads fear, silence becomes its greatest weapon. So remembering is not weakness. It is protection. The faces of the victims are mostly unknown. No statues. No medals. No parades. But their stories live on. In families. In whispers. In history finally told honestly. They were not heroes in books. But they were heroes of survival. Because living through terror, and still believing in tomorrow, is the bravest act of all. Stalin's name remains in history. Not only for power, but for pain. Not only for victories, but for voices silenced. And that is how he should be remembered. Not as a symbol of strength, but as a warning. A warning of what happens when one man controls fear, and a nation forgets to question. This is not just history. It is a lesson written in lives. Every time we speak about this past, we give meaning to suffering. We turn pain into purpose. We turn silence into voice. Stalin's war took everything from millions. But it gave the future one gift. A lesson too powerful to ignore. Never give fear your trust. Never give power your silence. And never forget that freedom must be protected every day. Not once in history, but always. This story ends here. But its message does not. Stalin's war on his own people is more than a chapter in the past. It is a mirror for every society. A reminder of what fear can build. And what courage can stop. We remember not to stay in pain, but to stay aware. Because when history is remembered, it loses the power to repeat itself. And that is the greatest victory of all.